Imagine for a moment the world of the ancient Mediterranean. The lapping of waves against a weathered shore, the distant call of seabirds, the slow rise of dawn across mountains and islands scattered like stepping stones across the sea. This is the stage on which Homer, one of the most enigmatic figures in human history, emerges. His name alone carries an aura of mystery and majesty. To many, he is the father of Western literature, the poet whose verses gave shape to the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems that have resounded through centuries like the steady rhythm of an ancient lyre. Yet even as we honor his legacy, we must admit a quiet truth. Homer himself is as much shadow as substance. Was he a single poet, a collective voice, or a myth in his own right? That question continues to intrigue scholars, and tonight we will drift gently into his world. In this exploration, we do not move at a hurried pace. Instead, like careful travelers walking the winding paths of Greek antiquity, we proceed slowly, pausing to observe the details that made this world so enduring. We begin with the origins of Greek culture in the Bronze Age, when the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations laid the foundations for the myths Homer later wove into poetry. Their palaces, adorned with frescoes of dolphins and spirals, reveal a people in deep connection with the sea. The collapse of these societies around 1200 BCE left Greece in what historians call a dark age, a period when writing faded, trade diminished, and communities withdrew into smaller villages. Yet from this seeming silence, oral traditions blossomed. Tales told by traveling bards around firesides, stories of gods and heroes passed from one voice to another until they became the fabric of memory itself. It is from this oral tradition that Homer arises. Picture a bard reciting verses by heart, each line carefully measured, each phrase carrying formulas designed to be remembered. The audience, perhaps seated beneath olive trees or within a courtyard, would have listened as familiar tales unfolded, of Troy, of wrath, of wandering. These epics were not fixed texts, but living performances, shaped by each retelling. When writing returned to Greece in the 8th century BCE, adapted from the Phoenician alphabet, it gave permanence to what had once lived only in sound. The poems attributed to Homer are the most famous result of this transition, bridging the oral and the written, the remembered and the recorded. But Homer's world is not only about poetry. To understand him fully, we must walk through the broader corridors of Greek life. We will wander through bustling agora markets, where pottery and olive oil changed hands. We will linger at the temples, where columns reached toward the sky, and offerings to Athena or Apollo carried the scent of incense. We will sail across the Aegean to witness how seafaring linked Greek communities into a shared culture, even as they remained politically independent. Each city-state, or polis, carried its own identity, yet all participated in the larger rhythm of Greek civilization. In this journey, we will also meet the gods. The pantheon of Greek religion is vivid and varied. Zeus commanding thunder from the heights of Olympus, Hera presiding with stern dignity, Athena embodying wisdom and strategy. These divine figures are not remote abstractions. They move among humans, shape destinies, and reveal truths about human ambition and frailty. Homer's epics, filled with divine intervention, remind us how deeply intertwined the sacred and the human were in Greek thought. Yet Homer's voice is not limited to tales of war or divine quarrel. The Odyssey, with its focus on return and recognition, invites us into the domestic sphere, the long yearning for home, the strength of patience. It teaches that the journey itself, with all its delays and detours, is as important as the destination. Such themes echo through the centuries, reminding us that human experience, of struggle, of longing, of resilience, remains constant even as civilizations rise and fall. As we drift through this narrative tonight, we will pass through 9 chapters, each unfolding another layer of Homer and ancient Greece. From the earliest myths to the grand architecture of Athens, from the performance of epic poetry to the quiet reflections on Homer's legacy, we will allow ourselves to be guided by curiosity, but also by calm. Every chapter is a lantern along the path, illuminating another portion of this vast story, while the tone remains gentle enough to soothe you toward rest. This introduction then serves as an invitation. It is an open doorway into a landscape rich with culture, poetry, and history. We begin in an age where memory carried the weight of tradition, and we will end in the enduring legacy that Homer has left behind, a legacy still studied in classrooms, still recited in theaters, still alive in translations across the world. As we embark, allow your mind to float gently, as though carried on the breeze of the Aegean Sea. With each detail, we move closer to understanding not only Homer, but also the civilization that nurtured him, a civilization whose quiet echoes shape our own world even now. And so, let us begin this quiet conquest of knowledge. Tonight, we fall asleep not into silence, but into story, where Homer and ancient Greece await us. The origins of Homer and the world that sustained his stories stretch back into the twilight of the Bronze Age, when civilizations rose and fell along the shores of the Mediterranean. To understand the roots of Homer's epics, we must look to two powerful cultures that flourished before his time, the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece. These early civilizations, each in their own way, contributed threads that would later be woven into the grand fabric of Greek myth and storytelling. The Minoans, who thrived from roughly 2600 to 1400 BCE, were a seafaring people whose influence reached across the Aegean. Their palaces, such as the sprawling complex at Knossos, stood as hubs of administration, trade, and ritual. Frescoes from these sites show leaping dolphins, lilies, and graceful figures moving through vibrant landscapes, revealing a society attuned to nature and artistry. Archaeologists note the absence of heavy fortifications around Minoan cities, suggesting they relied on their navy more than on walls for defense. From the Minoans, Greece inherited a deep connection to the sea, a motif that echoes endlessly in Homer's verses. The Mycenaeans, by contrast, were warriors as well as traders. Flourishing from about 1600 to 1100 BCE, they built fortified citadels at places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Their architecture, with massive cyclopean walls and imposing gates, speaks to a society accustomed to conflict and the need for defense. The famous Lion Gate of Mycenae, with its two carved beasts standing sentinel, is a powerful symbol of this era. Within their palaces, linear B tablets record inventories, taxes, and offerings to gods, providing glimpses of a complex administrative system. The Mycenaeans also shared in the broader culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, trading with Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. It is within the Mycenaean world that the legendary Trojan War is set, a conflict immortalized in Homer's Iliad. While historians debate whether the war was a literal historical event or a poetic amalgam of many struggles, archaeological evidence suggests that Troy, located in what is now Turkey, was indeed a city of importance. Layers of destruction found at the site of Hasarlik point to repeated conflicts during the Late Bronze Age, any one of which may have inspired tales of Troy's downfall. The blending of memory and myth, fact and imagination, is characteristic of how oral traditions preserve the past. Yet both the Minoans and Mycenaeans met with collapse. Around 1200 BCE, a series of upheavals swept across the eastern Mediterranean. The causes remain debated: climate change, invasions by so-called sea peoples, internal strife, or perhaps all of these combined. Palaces were abandoned, trade routes disrupted, and populations dispersed into smaller rural communities. For centuries after, Greece entered what scholars call the Dark Age, a term that suggests decline but also hides the resilience of its people. During this time, writing disappeared. The linear B script, once used to keep records, was forgotten. Without the written word, memory became the lifeline of culture. Stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors passed from mouth to mouth, recited in gatherings large and small. In the flickering light of hearth fires, listeners heard of mighty Achilles, clever Odysseus, and long-suffering Helen. These stories were not static. Each bard shaped them anew, improvising within the boundaries of traditional formulas. Phrases like rosy-fingered dawn or swift-footed Achilles served as building blocks, ensuring that the essence of the tale remained intact even as details shifted. This oral culture set the stage for Homer. When, centuries later, Greece adopted the alphabet from the Phoenicians, these fluid stories began to crystallize into text. But the depth and richness of the tales themselves had been nurtured during the long silence of the Dark Age. In this way, the collapse of one civilization became the seedbed of another. The transition from Bronze Age to Dark Age reveals the endurance of human imagination. Though cities fell and palaces crumbled, the stories remained, whispered across generations until they found their enduring form. As we reflect on this beginning, It is like listening to the soft overture before a symphony. The stage is set, the themes introduced, and in the centuries that follow, they will resound through the voice we call Homer. And so, as we move deeper into our journey, we leave behind the great palaces of Knossos and Mycenae, their walls now silent ruins. What remains alive is the memory, the pulse of story carried in human voices, waiting for the poet who would gather them into lasting form. It is here, in the twilight between collapse and renewal, that the Homeric tradition takes root, ready to guide us into the age of epic. The Greek Dark Age, stretching from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, is often described as a time of silence, a pause between the grandeur of the Mycenaean palaces and the brilliance of classical Greece. Yet silence does not mean emptiness. Beneath the apparent quiet of this age, cultural forces were at work, shaping the foundations upon which Homer would later build his epics. To understand Homer, we must walk carefully through this era of transition, when the written word had vanished, but the spoken story endured with remarkable vitality. When the Mycenaean palatial system collapsed, its centralized administration disintegrated. Without palaces to coordinate trade and production, communities grew smaller and more self-reliant. Villages replaced citadels, and households became the central units of economic life. Archaeological excavations reveal modest houses clustered together, often built of stone with thatched roofs surrounding open courtyards, where families cooked, crafted, and socialized. Pottery became simpler in design, though it continued to serve as both a practical vessel and a marker of local identity. The grand frescoes of the Bronze Age disappeared, but creativity did not vanish. In the rhythmic designs of Dark Age pottery, we glimpse continuity and adaptation. This shift to smaller communities meant that memory became the glue of identity. Without the written records once maintained on linear B tablets, people relied on oral tradition to preserve their history, their laws, and their myths. The poet or bard assumed an essential role in society. Carrying only a lyre and a repertoire of memorized formulas, the bard was a living library. Each performance was both preservation and innovation, as the singer adjusted details to suit the audience while remaining faithful to the core of the story. It is in this world that we begin to see the formation of what scholars later call the Homeric tradition. The poetic formulas we find in the Iliad and the Odyssey, phrases like wine-dark sea and rosy-fingered dawn, were not simply artistic flourishes, but practical devices. They allowed the bard to maintain rhythm and meter, and they served as memory aids in the lengthy recitation of thousands of lines. These recurring expressions also gave listeners familiar anchors, reassuring them that the story remained authentic even as it unfolded anew. Though written records were absent, the Dark Age was not without contact and exchange. Archaeology shows evidence of trade slowly reemerging, particularly through seafaring routes. The Aegean Sea, dotted with islands, functioned as a connective tissue between communities. Metalwork, pottery, and occasional luxury goods moved from shore to shore. Through these exchanges, ideas traveled as well, keeping Greek culture connected to the broader Mediterranean world. The seeds of renewal were already being sown. Around the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, a crucial innovation arrived: the Greek alphabet. Borrowed from the Phoenicians, this system of writing adapted consonantal symbols to include vowels, making it especially suited for recording the flowing cadences of Greek speech. Unlike the earlier linear B script, which had been used primarily for administrative purposes, the alphabet was accessible, versatile, and enduring. It gave the oral tradition a new permanence, ensuring that epic poetry could move from the realm of memory into the realm of text. Yet, before this innovation transformed storytelling, the bards of the Dark Age had already refined their craft to a high art. Imagine a gathering in a village courtyard where the flickering fire casts shadows on stone walls. The bard plucks the strings of a lyre and begins to sing. The audience leans forward, drawn into tales of gods and heroes, of journeys across the sea and battles fought for honor. In the quiet of the night, the community's past and present merge, carried on the rhythm of words. These performances were more than entertainment. They were acts of cultural preservation, shaping identity and transmitting values. The themes of loyalty, courage, hospitality, and fate that run through Homer's epics reflect this Dark Age society. In an age without palaces, Kinship and reputation were vital. To welcome the stranger, to honor one's word, to defend one's household, these were the pillars of survival and meaning. The stories that carried these values took root in collective memory, ensuring that even as Greece emerged from its so-called darkness, it did so with a rich tapestry of shared ideals. By the time Homer, or the tradition we call Homer, emerges, the groundwork has been laid. The Dark Age was not merely a void between civilizations. It was a crucible in which the oral tradition was forged, tested, and refined. What we inherit through the epics is a reflection of that endurance. The silence of writing gave rise to the eloquence of song, and the absence of palaces gave rise to the resilience of community. As we drift further along this journey, we leave behind the modest villages and shadowed courtyards of the Dark Age. Ahead lies the figure of Homer himself, or perhaps the many voices behind his name. Who was this poet? Was he a man, a myth, or a symbol for a tradition greater than any one individual? These questions await us in the next chapter, as we move from the murmur of oral memory to the enduring resonance of epic poetry. When we turn our attention to Homer himself, we encounter one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of literature. His name, like an echo across the centuries, is familiar to nearly everyone, yet the person behind it remains shrouded in uncertainty. Was Homer a single poet, a wandering bard who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey as we know them today? Or was Homer instead a symbolic name, representing a long tradition of oral poetry passed down and refined by countless singers before the epics were ever written? This puzzle is often referred to as the Homeric question, and while scholars have debated it for generations, the enigma only adds to Homer's mystique. The most common ancient tradition places Homer in the 8th century BCE, a time when Greece was just beginning to recover from the Dark Age and to rediscover writing through the newly adapted alphabet. Some ancient accounts claim he was blind, perhaps evoking the image of the inspired poet who sees through vision rather than sight. Others situate him in various Greek regions, Ionia, Chios, or Smyrna, each vying for the honor of being the poet's birthplace. Yet these traditions, though rich in imagery, do not resolve the central uncertainty, whether Homer was one man or many voices. To explore this question, we must look closely at the craft of epic poetry. The Iliad and the Odyssey are vast works, each composed of more than 12,000 lines of verse. Their structure is built upon a meter known as dactylic hexameter, a rhythmic pattern of syllables that lends itself to oral performance. This metrical form is demanding, yet the epics use formulaic phrases and recurring epithets to ease the burden of composition and memorization. Expressions such as swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered dawn appear again and again, not only for poetic effect, but as essential tools for the oral bard. These formulas allowed the poet to improvise fluidly, crafting long performances without the aid of written notes. Modern scholars, beginning with Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the 20th century, studied oral traditions in living cultures, such as the singers of epic poetry in the Balkans. They observed how bards could compose lengthy narratives on the spot, drawing upon a shared pool of formulas and themes. This research illuminated the techniques behind Homeric poetry and suggested that the Iliad and the Odyssey emerged from a similar oral milieu. In this light, Homer becomes less a solitary author and more the culmination of centuries of collective artistry. Still, there is evidence of unity in the epics, a guiding vision that binds them into coherent wholes. The Iliad is not merely a collection of battle stories. It revolves around the wrath of Achilles and its consequences, creating a tight narrative arc. Likewise, the Odyssey follows the trials of Odysseus with a consistency of theme and tone. Whether this unity was the work of a single master poet or the result of later editing, it speaks to the remarkable artistry of the tradition. Imagine, then, Homer, or the Homeric bard, performing before an audience. Perhaps it is a festival in Ionia, where people have gathered for religious celebrations. The poet, accompanied by the gentle strumming of a lyre, begins to sing. His voice rises and falls, carrying listeners into the world of Troy or across the wine-dark sea. The performance might last hours, even days, with the audience returning eagerly for each installment. In these moments, poetry is not a solitary act, but a communal experience, binding the listeners together through shared story. It is also worth noting how the invention of the Greek alphabet intersected with this tradition. The earliest written versions of the epics likely date from the late 8th or early 7th century BCE. The shift from oral performance to written text was transformative, giving permanence to what had once been fluid. Yet even in written form, the poems preserve their oral roots. Their formulas, repetitions, and rhythmic cadences remind us of the singers who carried them across generations. The Homeric question may never be answered definitively, and perhaps that is fitting. Homer's identity is less important than his voice, the voice that sings of war and homecoming, of gods and mortals, of fate and longing. Whether one poet or many, the Homeric tradition captures something timeless about human experience. It bridges the gap between history and myth, between memory and imagination. As we rest with these thoughts, we see Homer not only as a figure of mystery, but as a symbol of continuity. He embodies the endurance of storytelling, the ability of words to outlast palaces and empires, and the quiet power of the human voice. In the next chapter, we will step fully into the world of the Iliad, exploring the themes, characters, and cultural values that this great poem preserves. For now, let us drift gently, listening to the echo of a bard's song, rising and falling like the waves of the Aegean. The Iliad stands at the heart of Homer's legacy, a monumental poem that draws us into the final weeks of the Trojan War. More than a story of battle, it is a meditation on human passion, divine intervention, and the fragile thread of life. As we enter its world, we find ourselves not at the beginning of the war, but near its end, when tempers burn hottest and fate draws near. The central theme is the Manes, the wrath of Achilles. This anger, and the destruction it causes, ripples through every line of the poem, like the tremor of a plucked string. The opening invocation sets the tone. Homer calls upon the muse to sing of Achilles' wrath, which brought countless sorrows upon the Achaeans and sent many brave souls to Hades. From this first moment, the poem establishes a cosmic scope. The fate of heroes is not theirs alone. Their choices affect armies, families, and the will of the gods. The Iliad is not merely a war chronicle, but a reflection on the consequences of human emotion in a world where mortality is unavoidable. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, embodies both strength and vulnerability. His quarrel with Agamemnon, leader of the Achaeans, begins when Agamemnon dishonors him by seizing a war prize, the maiden Briseis. This insult to honor drives Achilles into withdrawal, refusing to fight even as his comrades suffer. His anger is more than personal. It is symbolic of the fragile bonds that hold societies together. Honor, reputation, and respect are the currency of this world, and when they are violated, chaos follows. While Achilles sulks in his tent, the battlefield roars with the clash of warriors. Among them rises Hector, Prince of Troy, a figure as noble as he is doomed. Unlike Achilles, who seeks immortal glory, Hector fights for his city, his wife Andromache, and his young son Astyanax. In one of the most moving scenes of the poem, Hector removes his helmet to soothe his frightened child, a moment that reveals the tender humanity behind the warrior's armor. Yet Hector's sense of duty pulls him back to the field, where he will ultimately face his destiny. The gods, ever present, weave themselves into the action. Athena guides, Apollo deceives, and Zeus himself weighs the fates of mortals on his scales. The gods in the Iliad are not distant abstractions, but active participants, embodying the unpredictability of life. They mirror human passions, quarreling, scheming, and favoring one side or another. Through them, the poem portrays a cosmos where divine will and human choice intertwine, making outcomes both inevitable and uncertain. The turning point comes when Patroclus, dear companion of Achilles, enters the battle wearing Achilles' armor. His bravery inspires the Greeks, but it also draws the wrath of Hector, who slays him. Patroclus' death shatters Achilles' pride and channels his wrath into a storm of vengeance. In grief and fury, Achilles returns to the battlefield, his rage no longer contained. His slaughter of Trojan warriors culminates in his duel with Hector. Their confrontation, one of the most famous in literature, captures the tragic beauty of the epic. Hector, despite his courage, cannot withstand Achilles' fury. As he falls, Hector begs that his body be returned to his family for burial, but Achilles, still consumed by rage, refuses. He drags Hector's body behind his chariot, an act of desecration that shocks even the gods. In this moment, The poem lays bare the destructive power of unchecked anger, showing how it can erode not only one's enemies, but one's own humanity. Yet the Iliad does not end in cruelty. In its final book, Priam, king of Troy and father of Hector, comes to Achilles to beg for his son's body. Guided by Hermes, Priam enters Achilles' tent, kisses the hands that killed his child, and pleads for mercy. Achilles, moved by the shared grief of fatherhood, relents. He returns Hector's body, and together the two men, once enemies, weep for their losses. This reconciliation provides the poem with a quiet but profound conclusion. It does not celebrate victory or peace, but instead honors the shared sorrow of mortality. The Iliad teaches us that glory and rage, while powerful, are fleeting. Human life is fragile, and even the mightiest warrior cannot escape fate. What endures is compassion, the brief moments when adversaries recognize their common humanity. This message, sung across the centuries, remains as resonant today as it was in ancient Greece. As we step away from the battlefield of Troy, we carry with us the rhythm of shields clashing, the cries of warriors, and the whisper of gods. Yet we also carry the memory of Priam and Achilles weeping together in the night. In the next chapter, we will follow Odysseus, whose story continues beyond Troy as he wanders across seas and islands in search of home. His journey, filled with wonder and hardship, forms the heart of the Odyssey. For now, let us rest with the echoes of the Iliad, a song of wrath, sorrow, and fragile peace. If the Iliad is the song of wrath, the Odyssey is the song of return. Where the first epic immerses us in the furious clash of warriors, the second guides us through a long and winding journey across seas, islands, and unknown lands. The central figure here is Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a man defined not by brute strength, but by his cleverness, endurance, and longing for home. His story reminds us that the end of war is not the end of struggle. For many, the true challenge begins in the quest to return, to reclaim the life left behind. The Odyssey begins not with Odysseus himself, but with his absence. It has been nearly 20 years since he left for Troy, and his palace in Ithaca is overrun by suitors seeking to marry his wife, Penelope. These men consume his wealth, disrespect his household, and press Penelope to abandon hope. Yet she resists, weaving by day and secretly unraveling her work by night, a quiet act of defiance that preserves her loyalty. Their son, Telemachus, comes of age in this atmosphere of tension, uncertain whether his father still lives. Already we sense the theme of endurance, how those who remain must wait, hope, and resist despair. Odysseus himself, meanwhile, is far from home. Held captive on the island of Ogygia by the nymph Calypso, he longs to return to Ithaca. The gods intervene. Athena, ever the patron of cleverness, pleads for his release, while Poseidon, offended by Odysseus's earlier deeds, seeks to delay him at every turn. Thus begins the long voyage home, where each encounter carries both danger and insight. The journey is a tapestry of marvels. On the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus' men taste the lotus fruit and forget their homes, drifting into a dreamlike stupor. Here we glimpse the human temptation to abandon responsibility for comfort, to surrender to oblivion rather than endure the trials of life. Next comes the cave of the Cyclops, where Odysseus' wit saves his men from death. He blinds the one-eyed giant Polyphemus and escapes beneath the bellies of sheep. Yet his pride betrays him when he shouts his name, provoking Poseidon's lasting wrath. Further trials follow, the enchantments of Circe, who turns men into swine but is outwitted by Odysseus. The perilous passage between Scylla and Charybdis, where 6 men are lost to the monster's jaws. The Sirens, whose alluring song is resisted only by binding Odysseus to the mast of his ship. Each episode reveals not only external dangers, but the inner challenges of human desire, pride, and resilience. One of the most haunting episodes is Odysseus' descent into the underworld. There he encounters the shades of the dead, his mother, his comrades, and the prophet Tiresias. This journey into shadow deepens the epic's meditation on mortality. Odysseus learns that even heroes are subject to death, that life is fleeting, and that wisdom lies in endurance rather than conquest. When he returns to the world of the living, he carries with him a heightened sense of purpose. Eventually, after years of wandering, Odysseus reaches Ithaca. Disguised as a beggar, with Athena's guidance, he surveys the suitors and plans his revenge. The recognition scenes that follow are among the most moving in literature. First, he is recognized by his faithful dog Argos, who dies content after seeing his master once more. Later, his old nurse Euryclea identifies him by a scar on his leg, a mark of youthful adventure. Finally, Penelope herself tests him by asking about their marriage bed, which only he could describe. These moments remind us that identity is revealed not only in appearance, but in memory, in the bonds that tie lives together. The climax arrives when Odysseus reveals himself and, with Telemachus by his side, confronts the suitors. The palace once again rings with the clash of battle, but unlike the Iliad, this violence restores rather than destroys. Order returns, loyalty is rewarded, and Odysseus is reunited with Penelope in a moment of hard-earned peace. The Odyssey is more than a tale of adventure. It is a meditation on the meaning of home, the value of patience, and the endurance of love. Where Achilles seeks immortal glory, Odysseus seeks the warmth of hearth and family. In this contrast, we see two visions of the human condition. One striving for eternal fame, the other for the quiet permanence of belonging. Both are noble, yet the Odyssey reminds us that in the end, the journey home may be the greatest achievement of all. As we drift away from Odysseus' adventures, we carry with us the rhythm of the sea, the whisper of the sirens, and the warmth of reunion by the fireside. In the next chapter, we will turn our gaze upward to the gods themselves, whose presence in Homer's epics shapes the fates of mortals and reveals the divine tapestry of the Greek imagination. In Homer's world, mortals never stand alone. Above and around them move the gods, shaping destinies, stirring passions, and reminding humans of the fragile line between freedom and fate. To understand Homer and ancient Greece, we must pause to look closely at this divine company, the pantheon of deities whose presence saturates both the Iliad and the Odyssey. These gods are not remote or silent. They stride into battle, whisper into the minds of kings, and alter the course of voyages with a wave of their hands. The supreme figure is Zeus, king of the gods, who reigns from Mount Olympus. His authority is immense, yet not absolute. Even Zeus must heed the weight of fate, which the Greeks believed stood above gods and mortals alike. In the Iliad, Zeus is often portrayed as a balancer of scales, weighing the lives of heroes in his hands. His thunderbolts command awe, but his role is less about absolute control than about maintaining cosmic order, even when that order leads to sorrow. Beside him stands Hera, queen of the gods, whose sharp wit and will rival those of her husband. Hera often supports the Greeks in the Trojan War, her interventions showing the gods' capacity for loyalty, but also for personal vendetta. She is not distant, but deeply entangled in human struggles, as much a participant in conflict as any mortal warrior. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, plays a crucial role in both epics. She favors Odysseus for his cleverness, guiding him with counsel and disguises, and she frequently aids Achilles and other heroes on the battlefield. Her presence illustrates the Greek reverence for intelligence, planning, and calm foresight, qualities that balance the raw force of strength. When Athena intervenes, it is often to tip the scales toward order and reason, though never to erase the challenges of human life. In contrast, Poseidon embodies the unpredictable fury of the sea. His quarrel with Odysseus drives much of the Odyssey, as storms and delays keep the hero from Ithaca. To the Greeks, the sea was both a source of wealth and terror, its surface glittering with trade and travel, yet capable of sudden violence. Poseidon personifies this duality, reminding mortals that the forces of nature lie forever beyond their control. Other gods weave in and out of Homer's verses. Apollo, radiant god of music, healing, and plague, sends arrows of disease upon the Greeks when his priest is dishonored. Aphrodite, goddess of love, protects Paris and embodies the irresistible power of desire, a force that even warriors cannot ignore. Ares, the god of war, charges into battle with chaotic energy, representing the brutal, destructive side of conflict. These divine figures mirror human emotions, magnified to cosmic scale. They quarrel, they take sides, they even deceive one another. In them, the Greeks saw not perfection, but a reflection of their own passions, projected into myth. Religious life in ancient Greece extended beyond epic poetry. The gods of Homer were honored in temples, rituals, and sacrifices. Sanctuaries, often placed in dramatic landscapes such as mountaintops or groves, provided spaces where mortals could approach the divine. Offerings of wine, grain, or animals carried prayers upward, binding communities together through shared worship. Festivals celebrated the gods with music, athletic contests, and dramatic performance, blending piety with communal joy. Yet the gods were not simply benevolent guardians. They reminded mortals of their limits. Hubris, excessive pride, was considered a grave offense, often punished by divine retribution. When Odysseus taunts the blinded Cyclops and boasts of his name, Poseidon's wrath is kindled, prolonging his suffering. When Agamemnon dishonors Apollo's priest, a plague devastates his army. Through such episodes, Homer teaches us that mortals must live with humility, recognizing the power of forces greater than themselves. At the same time, the gods' interventions provide comfort. Athena's guidance reassures Odysseus that his wit is valued, that endurance is rewarded. Zeus's eventual decision to allow Hector's body to be returned to Priam offers a glimpse of mercy, even amid tragedy. In these moments, the divine presence is not only a reminder of human fragility, but also of the possibility of grace. As we reflect on the role of gods in Homer's world, we see how deeply intertwined the sacred and the human were in Greek thought. For the Greeks, to live was to dwell in a cosmos alive with divine presence, where every storm, every victory, and every sorrow might carry the imprint of a god's hand. This vision created a universe that was at once unpredictable and meaningful, filled with awe and reverence. From the lofty heights of Olympus, we now return to Earth. In the next chapter, we will leave behind the halls of gods and step into the daily lives of ordinary Greeks. The homes, markets, and rhythms of existence that formed the background against which epic poetry was sung. For even as Homer sang of heroes and deities, his world was sustained by farmers, artisans, and families whose quiet labors gave shape to civilization. When we step away from the lofty struggles of gods and heroes, we arrive in the quiet rhythms of daily life in ancient Greece. This is the world in which Homer's audiences lived, the backdrop of fields, villages, and marketplaces that shaped how they understood his stories. Though epic poetry spoke of kings and warriors, it was sung to men and women who tilled soil, wove cloth, and bartered goods in bustling agoras. To imagine their lives is to add texture and depth to the songs of Homer, grounding them in the lived experience of ordinary Greeks. The Greek household, or oikos, was the center of daily existence. A typical home was modest, built of stone or sun-dried brick, with an open courtyard at its heart. This courtyard served as the focal point of family life. Children played, women wove, and men entertained guests there. Rooms arranged around the courtyard were often simple and small, with few furnishings beyond beds, stools, and storage jars. The hearth, tended by the goddess Hestia, symbolized continuity and protection, its flame binding the family to both tradition and the divine. Agriculture dominated the economy and daily routines. Most Greeks worked the land, growing barley, wheat, grapes, and olives. Olive trees, hardy and enduring, provided oil for cooking, lighting, and ritual use. Vines produced wine, diluted with water and shared in communal gatherings. Goats and sheep grazed the hills, offering milk, wool, and meat. Farming was seasonal, guided by the rhythms of the sun and stars. Hesiod, a poet slightly later than Homer, describes in his Works and Days how the plowman looked to the constellations for signs of when to sow and harvest. Such practices remind us how closely tied the Greeks were to the cycles of nature. Trade and craftsmanship complemented farming. In coastal towns, fishermen cast nets into the wine-dark sea, while merchants carried pottery, olive oil, and metalwork across the Aegean. Potters shaped clay into amphorae for storage and transport, decorating them with geometric designs, or later with figures from myth. Blacksmiths and carpenters provided tools essential for both agriculture and household tasks. In every polis, the agora served as the hub of exchange, a marketplace alive with voices, bargaining, and news. It was here that community life unfolded, where citizens not only traded goods, but also shared stories and ideas. The role of women, though often confined to the household, was vital. They managed the domestic sphere, weaving cloth, baking bread, and overseeing servants or slaves when present. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope embodies both loyalty and cunning, weaving and unweaving her loom to delay the suitors. Her actions reflect the real importance of textile work in Greek households, where weaving was both a craft and a symbol of continuity. Women also played key roles in religious rituals, offering sacrifices and participating in festivals, ensuring that the sacred order of the community was maintained. Children grew into these roles gradually, learning by imitation. Boys often trained in athletics and in later centuries studied music and letters if their families could afford it. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. Stories, however, were the inheritance of all. Around the hearth or in public gatherings, children would have heard tales of gods and heroes, absorbing values of courage, loyalty, and hospitality. These stories, when sung by bards, connected everyday life to the grand narratives of myth. Hospitality, or xenia, was a cornerstone of Greek society. The expectation that strangers should be welcomed, fed, and treated with respect was both a social obligation and a sacred duty, overseen by Zeus himself. In the Odyssey, the contrast between good hosts, like the Phaeacians, and violators of hospitality, like the suitors, underscores the importance of this value. For ordinary Greeks, the practice of offering bread, wine, and a place by the fire was more than courtesy. It was a bond of trust that sustained networks of kinship and alliance. Religion infused daily routines. Small household shrines honored deities with offerings of grain or wine. Public festivals, accompanied by processions, sacrifices, and athletic contests, connected individuals to the life of the polis. These rituals, whether grand or humble, affirmed the belief that divine favor was essential for prosperity and protection. In this tapestry of daily life, we see how Homer's epics found their audience. The struggles of Achilles and Odysseus resonated not because everyone lived as heroes, but because the themes, honor, loyalty, endurance, spoke to farmers, artisans, and families. A man sowing barley in the fields might hear of Achilles' wrath and reflect on the cost of pride. A woman weaving cloth might hear of Penelope's loom and feel affirmed in her quiet strength. In this way, the epics bridged the gap between myth and reality, connecting the extraordinary to the ordinary. As we drift from these humble homes and busy markets, we carry the sense of a living world, where myth and daily labor intertwined. In the next chapter, we will step into the political and cultural heart of Greece, the polis, the city-state, where identity was forged and collective life took on new meaning. As Greek society emerged from the long centuries of the Dark Age, it coalesced into a new form of community, the polis, or city-state. This development marked one of the most distinctive features of ancient Greece and shaped every aspect of its culture, politics, and identity. To understand Homer's audience and the world that gave his stories enduring meaning, we must step into the life of the polis, where myth, politics, and daily existence blended into a single fabric. A polis was not simply a city in the modern sense. It was a community of people bound together by shared identity, laws, and religious practices. Each polis consisted of an urban center, often built around an acropolis, a fortified hill that housed temples and sanctuaries, and the surrounding countryside, where most of the population farmed. The Acropolis of Athens, crowned by later monuments such as the Parthenon, exemplifies this union of sacred and civic life. Though even in Homer's time, the Acropolis already served as the symbolic heart of the community. The agora, or marketplace, lay at the center of civic interaction. Here, citizens gathered not only to trade goods, but also to exchange ideas, resolve disputes, and deliberate on collective matters. The agora buzzed with voices, merchants selling wares, farmers bartering produce, and philosophers or poets reciting verses. In this public space, communal identity was reinforced daily. Homeric poetry, performed before assembled audiences, fit seamlessly into this environment, blending entertainment with moral instruction and cultural cohesion. The polis also defined political life. Each community developed its own system of governance, ranging from monarchies and aristocracies to the early experiments in democracy. In Homer's epics, we see traces of this world: assemblies where warriors debate, councils where elders advise, and kings whose authority depends not only on divine favor, but also on the support of their people. Agamemnon's disputes with Achilles and Odysseus's encounters in foreign courts echo the political dynamics of the polis, where leadership required persuasion as well as power. Religion lay at the heart of the polis. Temples dedicated to gods such as Athena, Apollo, or Zeus crowned acropolises and dominated civic life. Festivals, often combining athletic contests, dramatic performances, and sacrifices, served as both religious devotion and civic celebration. The Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE, are one famous example of how religious ritual and shared identity extended beyond individual city-states to unite the Greeks as a whole. Within each polis, however, local cults and traditions reinforced a sense of belonging, binding citizens together under the watchful gaze of their patron deities. The polis also gave shape to cultural achievements. As communities grew more stable and prosperous, they supported art, architecture, and literature. Pottery became more elaborate, decorated with scenes of myth that echoed the tales of Homer. Stone temples rose, their columns expressing balance and harmony. Poetry and music flourished, with rhapsodes, professional reciters performing Homeric epics at festivals. These public performances ensured that Homer's voice remained central to Greek identity, his stories reinforcing the values of courage, loyalty, and piety that defined the polis. Life within the polis was structured by citizenship. To be a citizen meant more than residence. It implied participation in the collective responsibilities of defense, decision-making, and worship. Excluded from full citizenship were women, slaves, and foreigners. Yet even these groups contributed to the life of the polis through labor, trade, and household management. The exclusivity of citizenship highlights both the achievements and the limitations of Greek political life, reminding us that the shared identity of the polis was both inclusive and selective. The polis also fostered a competitive spirit. City-states vied with one another in commerce, warfare, and cultural prestige. Yet they also recognized a shared heritage, expressed through language, religion, and tradition. This tension between rivalry and unity is reflected in Homer's epics. The Greeks joined together to fight at Troy, yet they are plagued by quarrels and rivalries. Such tensions mirrored the lived reality of the polis, where independence and interdependence coexisted in fragile balance. In this setting, Homer's epics found fertile ground. The Iliad and the Odyssey did not belong to one city-state, but to all of Greece. They articulated values that transcended local identities, offering a shared cultural heritage that bound the diverse polis together. At the same time, each polis could find in the epics reflections of its own concerns, the responsibilities of leadership, the importance of loyalty, and the inevitability of fate. As we leave the agora and climb the steps of the Acropolis, we glimpse the polis as both a physical and spiritual community. It is a place where farmers, artisans, soldiers, and poets coexist, where temples rise beside marketplaces, and where stories echo through the air like the voice of Homer himself. From this foundation, Greek civilization would flourish, eventually giving rise to the philosophical, artistic, and political achievements of the classical age. In the next chapter, we will look beyond Homer's lifetime to his enduring legacy, how his poetry continued to shape Greek identity, how it was preserved, studied, and reimagined through the centuries, and how it still speaks to us today. As we arrive at the final stage of our journey, we turn our gaze from Homer's time to the centuries that followed, where his words lived on, reshaped, revered, and transmitted across cultures. The legacy of Homer is vast, reaching from ancient Greece through Rome in the Middle Ages and into our own era. His epics, born in the oral tradition and first written down in the early Archaic Age, became the foundational texts of Western literature. In them, we hear not only the echoes of the Bronze Age, but also the enduring rhythms of human experience. In ancient Greece itself, Homer quickly became central to education and identity. By the classical period, children were taught to read and recite passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey, learning language, values, and history through their verses. For Athenians in the 5th century BCE, Homer was not just poetry, he was a teacher. His epics defined ideals of heroism, endurance, and piety, but they also served as a mirror of human frailty, cautioning against hubris and unchecked rage. Public recitations at festivals ensured that the epics remained alive in the communal imagination. To know Homer was to know oneself as Greek. Philosophers, however, often wrestled with Homer's legacy. Plato, in his Republic, questioned whether Homer should be included in an ideal curriculum, arguing that the gods in the epics behave with jealousy, deceit, and pettiness unworthy of divine beings. Yet even as Plato criticized, he could not escape Homer's influence. Aristotle, by contrast, praised Homer's artistry, especially his ability to focus narratives around central themes and characters. For both philosophers, Homer remained an unavoidable presence, a poet whose words demanded engagement, whether in admiration or critique. The Romans, too, adopted Homer as their own. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE, consciously mirrors both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Where Homer sang of Achilles' wrath and Odysseus' wanderings, Virgil told of Aeneas' duty, weaving Homeric themes into a Roman vision of destiny and empire. Through Virgil and later Roman writers, Homer's influence extended across the Mediterranean, securing his place as the poet of poets. During the Middle Ages, Homer's presence in Western Europe diminished as Greek language and texts were less widely known. Yet his legacy endured in Byzantium, where scholars preserved and studied the epics. Manuscripts were copied, commentaries written, and the Homeric poems remained central to Greek-speaking education. When the Renaissance revived interest in classical learning, Homer returned to the West, carried by scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Humanists embraced his epics as treasures of antiquity, translating them into Latin and the vernacular languages of Europe. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century transformed Homer's accessibility. No longer limited to manuscript copies, the epics circulated widely, influencing poets, playwrights, and thinkers across Europe. In England, translations by George Chapman in the early 17th century inspired writers like Shakespeare and John Keats. Keats' sonnet, On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, captures the awe of encountering Homer's voice anew, as though discovering a new world. In every age, Homer has offered fresh inspiration, his verses adaptable to the questions and desires of the present. Modern archaeology has also deepened Homer's legacy. In the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann excavated sites such as Troy and Mycenae, seeking to prove that Homer's tales reflected historical reality. While Schliemann's methods were often crude, his discoveries brought to light a Bronze Age world that resonated with the settings of the epics. Archaeology confirmed that behind Homer's poetry lay memories of real places, however mythologized they had become. This blending of history and story continues to fascinate scholars and audiences alike. Today, Homer's epics remain part of global culture. They are studied in classrooms, translated into countless languages, adapted into novels, films, and even modern retellings that reimagine the ancient stories through new perspectives. Writers such as Margaret Atwood in The Penelopiad or Madeline Miller in Circe revisit Homer's characters, giving voice to those once silent. These works show how Homer's epics, though ancient, remain fertile ground for reflection on gender, power, and identity. The endurance of Homer rests not only in his narratives, but in the universality of his themes. The Iliad asks what it means to face mortality, to rage against dishonor, and to seek reconciliation even amid loss. The Odyssey explores the yearning for home, the trials of endurance, and the bonds of family. These questions are as alive today as they were in archaic Greece. To read Homer is to confront the depths of human experience, illuminated by divine presence yet grounded in mortal fragility. And so we return, gently, to the figure of Homer himself. Whether man or myth, singular poet or collective voice, his legacy has crossed 3 millennia. His songs have been sung in palaces and marketplaces, in monasteries and classrooms, on stage and on page. They have comforted, challenged, and inspired countless generations. As we drift into rest, let us carry with us the cadence of his verses, the dawn with rosy fingers, the wine-dark sea, the weary traveler finding home. In these images, we find not only the essence of ancient Greece, but also the enduring pulse of humanity. Homer's conquest has been quiet yet complete. His voice, rising from the shores of the Aegean, still speaks to us, inviting reflection, wonder, and calm. And tonight, as we fall asleep to his story, we become part of that long tradition, carried gently on the rhythm of his words.